This may be a longer and different discussion, but listen to Marcia talk the numbers and listen to Nancy talk the numbers. And, you know, we've got numbers on this stuff. And two points related. I mean, one is maybe the first item on the Wonk's manifesto needs to be that at some point when they've been sufficiently educated on the numbers, policyholders, policymakers have to be held responsible for the policies they're not fixing. That to allow this stuff to continue is a policy, and at the point we've made as communities and whatever other entree we've got, we've made it clear that the policies they've decided aren't working. There's got to be some accountability there. The actual policy option for the post-Obama election period is fixing Sandoval, which was the court decision in the late 90s that stripped the disproportionate impact authority out of the Civil Rights Act and required there be, basically you had to prove the plot. It wasn't enough to just demonstrate the damage. You had to prove there was a conspiracy to do it. And that was not a constitutional decision, that was a legislative interpretation. So it could be fixed with legislation. And it comes back every time we raise this stuff. It's like...
Yeah, I just wanted, because I know that earlier there was a comment about federal legislation and all that. Well, Congress did pass law. That's how OJJDP got started, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So every single state receives federal monies to look at DMC, okay? But can anybody tell me what is the teeth behind that legislation? There's nothing behind that legislation other than to just that, say what it is. How bad is our disproportionality in our state, right? But it's never had the teeth that says, and if you implement these monies in such a way, what are your outcomes? There's never been any accountability to that legislation. And so even with the economic development that we're talking about, how do we remove some of that funding? People across the country have utilized a lot of this funding to bigger jails. The whole 90s was about scaring every single community to build from 100 beds to 300 beds. So, and if you have 300 beds, you're going to want to fill them. And you're going to bring all your judges, all your probation officers, all your detention officers to fill it and to hold it and keep it there. But if I'm telling you that the data is there that tells you that the majority of those kids are low and medium risk kids, that you will not compromise public safety whatsoever by releasing those kids, what is the problem? That to me, it's structural racism at its core.
It's not only that you won't be creating a worse problem, you actually are creating a worse problem by putting all the kids in prison, surrounding them with each other, without giving them alternatives in terms of how to change their behavior. They actually come out way worse.
That's where they learn that culture. A couple, real quickly, one of the things I just thought of too, in listening to Marcia talk too, in terms of the whole rise of the prison industry, and this, which is parallel to this push for increasing jails. We've been seeing an increase in a push for privatization of jails, so I think the idea of having public control of jails is also an important part of the strategy. But I think along with that, a lot of these folks that were pushing, that are private, the big private corporations, jail corporations, were also big pushers of the voucher system for education. So it was a form of double dipping. They were going to get money for educating at the same time they got their per capita for the incarceration. And also, Bernalillo County is also one of the locations for one of these juvenile justice Annie Casey Foundation models, and we're doing many of the similar kinds of innovative programs there. And the gentleman who is the director of that is really fabulous. The issue, I think, becomes how do we institutionalize that? How do we make sure that once he retires, that we continue to keep that kind of momentum going and those kind of values going? Then I want to just quickly tell you about a national study around marijuana use, for example, that shows that at every single age group there is more marijuana use by whites than by anybody else. Every single age group, and yet when you look at the figures for arrests, convictions, and incarceration, it's like major. It's such a significant difference, again, at every age group. And then I want to speak to a couple of sort of more general issues. One is it relates to the kind of violence that we are seeing is violence, a lot of it is self-sabotaging violence that a lot of kids get into because of this kind of abuse that they're experiencing. And then there's a lot of violence of our own against our own. And so I think part of the one of the tragedies of all of this is the way that we're turning even against ourselves, particularly our young men against other young men. And then finally, as we've talked and emphasized so much, the fact that so many of our men are being incarcerated and the tragedy that has for our community when so many of our men are in jails and not in their communities. The other issue that we need to look at is the fact that it's the women, the young women that are being left behind then to maintain the community, to maintain the family, to maintain the household, to maintain the community. And that then has a whole nother set of dynamics that also even contribute to the cycle where you're having a lot of households then where there aren't men, there aren't fathers in those households, which begins also to add to the perpetuation of these cycles. But I think the burden on our young women is tremendous, and all the issues I think that in terms of the support that young women need in dealing with some of the issues that they face when their men are brought into the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much for your comments. You really should have been up here also. But I just want to say a couple of things. When you mentioned about the marijuana arrest, and you're absolutely correct, it's not just marijuana. With crack cocaine, contrary to what you hear in the media, more whites use crack than blacks. But overwhelmingly, over 90% of blacks are the ones who are arrested and incarcerated under lengthy mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine. And then you look at the disparity, you talk about disparity versus disproportion, the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. This is what's called a 100-to-1 difference with respect to the sentencing, but it all also goes down to policy choices as to where the law enforcement is deployed. And you talked about men in the system. By far, the largest demographic group in prisons are men of color, specifically African American men. But the second largest, fastest growing demographic group are African American women in terms of in the criminal justice system. And a lot of it has to do, again, with policy in terms of the drug laws and the conspiracy provision. We're in what we euphemistically call the girlfriend problem. You might be associated with a male or boyfriend or somebody who's using drugs or something along those lines. And because of the way the law is structured, you get caught up into the net as well. You might not, courts have even said, judges, I know Kimber Smith never used any drugs, never handled any drugs, but because she was part of the quote-unquote conspiracy, she got the exact same amount of time as her drug dealing boyfriend. And it can be issues as innocuous as simply answering a phone and taking messages, believe it or not, and get subject to these law mandatory minimum sentences. It's happening across the board, and it's increasingly bringing women into the system. And the last thing I wanted to just say, I think you originally talked about this you did, I'm sorry, intent versus impact. Real big problem, particularly in the criminal justice system. Real big problem. There are no smoking guns. You're not going to find a prosecutor or law enforcement officer saying that I arrested this person because he was black. I charged this person with a law mandatory minimum sentence because he was black. You're not going to find those smoking guns anymore. But you have the discriminatory impact when you have those numbers and you show that the disproportionate numbers of people who are being impacted by these laws come from communities of color. That is what is actionable. And somebody earlier was talking about the international sphere, international, I forgot who it was. International law is more advanced in this sphere. International law, the Commission on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the CERD Convention, recognizes discriminatory impact as actionable if you can't prove intent. We need to bring those same standards to U.S. justice system so that we can have some type of remedies as well.